Hello, this is Toby. I wanted to say a few words about the episode that you're about to hear before we get going with it, because it's slightly different from a lot of the other episodes that we have on this podcast. As you know, if you've been listening for a while, the usual format here is that I have what I often call a conversation, but really, let's face it, it's just an interview where I ask some questions to someone who knows a lot more than I do about whatever we're talking about, and then they give the answers. This episode is a little bit different in that it is really the continuation of a three-way conversation, which began in the autumn of 2023 between my two guests, Andrea and Clara, and myself, when we were all at a conference on science communication. And at some point when we were chatting at that conference, I don't remember exactly who came out of the closet first, but it turned out we were all people who worked in sciencey domains, but were also deep down really artists, musicians and artists. And I don't want to speak for them in this kind of preamble bit, but certainly I feel like even after 20 years or so, I still feel fundamentally I'm a musician who somehow managed to bluff his way into the room where the science people are hanging out. So anyway, we started talking about this, naturally enough, and about the interaction between art and science and what that's all about. And I realised quite quickly that both Andrea and Clara had thought about this topic a lot more deeply than I had. And we didn't get to finish the conversation, actually. I mean, I can't remember why someone else interrupted, or we had to go for a gondola ride, or I don't know what. But somehow the conversation stuck with me, and then a few weeks later, I realised that I still wanted to finish it. So I fired off an email to these two, and one thing led to another, and here we are. So the episode you're about to hear, as I say, is a continuation of an informal three-way conversation rather than a kind of structured, planned interview. Having said that, I found it very interesting and stimulating, and I hope you do too. Enjoy the episode. Hello. Welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name's Toby, and today I'm joined by Andrea Heilrath and Clara Roca-Sastre. Andrea is based at the Technical University of Berlin. She has a particular interest in science communication, especially the interface between science and the arts, in which area she has co-invented a musical instrument that can be ridden like a bicycle. Actually, it looks more like a bicycle that can be played like an instrument. And she is studying for a PhD in physics. And Clara is also a physicist by training, and she now works as a science coordinator and communicator at Berlin's Humboldt University. She is the co-founder of the art science collective Parallax, which enables creative collaborations between scientific and artistic disciplines, and has an extremely funky website. So, Clara and Andrea, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Toby. Thank you for having us here.
Hey, nice to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So before we get started, Andrea, please tell us about this musical instrument that can be ridden like a bicycle.
So I think the one that you're referring to is the Helmholtz Siren bike. So this is something in between a physics experiment and a musical instrument. It is referring to the research of Hermann von Helmholtz. Well, he was doing research about several things, but also about acoustics and also psychoacoustics, how we perceive sound, and especially on like why musical intervals are perceived as harmonic or inharmonic. And one tool he used was the siren, which is a simple setup to produce sound waves in a controlled manner, basically a rotating disc with holes in it. And we mounted this disc. This was a collaboration between me and Johannes Kaspar Walter, who's a composer based in Basel. And the goal behind this was to make this like research from Helmholtz more playable, accessible, and to connect music with science.
And so obviously you had to make a bicycle.
Yeah. Yes.
So what's the idea? I sit on it and I pedal, and my pedal power turns the wheel at different speeds and makes music.
Yeah, so you can sit on a bicycle and therefore speed up the disc that is rotating. And the faster the disc is rotating, the higher the pitch of the sound, which is like a simple connection, but it shows you how sound waves can be produced just by a flow of air through holes that are repeated in a periodic manner.
So in theory, I could play a tune on this thing just by precisely controlling the speed of my pedaling.
Yeah. Which is a hard thing to do. So it's more of an experimental instrument.
I get it. So we're not actually adding it to the orchestra anytime soon. Hopefully this is a smooth way to approach the point I want to get to in this conversation, which is to bounce around this idea of the role of the arts in science, and specifically in scientific advice and science for policy. I think many people do talk these days about the importance of including many different disciplines in science advice processes, and this kind of mantra, even kind of cliche, that people are always repeating, that science advice is not just about the natural sciences, but also about, then they always say, the social sciences, the arts and the humanities, which sounds great. But when you actually ask for examples of what that might mean, you get lots of examples of how social sciences are relevant to science advice. I mean, to me, that's not even really a question. It's just obvious. You get some examples of how the humanities are relevant, but you rarely, if ever, hear anyone actually giving examples of the arts having expertise to offer to help policy making. And also, I personally don't have a clear idea of what that would look like, which is why we're here. You've both worked in this area of contact between art and science, and you are, in fact, collaborators with each other yourselves. So I think my first question is, what kind of projects have you both been working on?
Andrea and I met in the physics building because we're both studying physics, and we were a group of people that were not just interested about what we were learning there, like training in physics, but also about connecting with the art, the music scene, the club scene in Berlin. So we started to take some experiments out with the help of many other physicists. We are not just the two of us alone, and put them in unexpected places where you wouldn't feel that science should be. So, for instance, in a club or in a gallery or so on. So we started to put experiments there, and people were wondering, what are they? Why do they look like this? And we were just there and saying, hey, that's physics. And we were explaining some kind of the beauty of it, and also letting people ask us questions. And we learned, we started to realize this was a very fulfilling experience to really bring the physics out of the physics department and really put it in this public space. With the time, we started to develop more and more our own installations and go further away from the experiments that we used to have from the physics lab, which we were using actually in order to learn physics. And I think we have been doing this for almost 10 years now. And from this experience, we realized that this had a lot of potential, this combination between art and science, because the experiments had this sensorial experience. People told things to us hey, if I would have learned physics like this at school, I would have liked to continue doing physics. It was for me horrible at school. I couldn't understand it. And now it's so easy. I can grasp it. So I think we all felt that this was kind of important to continue with this work. And we got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, so now I'm imagining you rocking up to a techno club in Berlin with a mass spectrometer or something and saying, can I just plug this thing in here? Give me some examples of the kinds of things you were doing in those early days.
Perhaps I can give some examples. One of the simplest things that we took in the beginning was fluorescent experiments, like when you put a specific substance and drop it into water and then use UV light, it's glowing and you can see fluid dynamics. Another experiment that was important from the beginning on was non-Newtonian fluids. So I think this is kind of known experiment.
This is the thing with corn flour, right? Where you throw around a ball of corn flour.
Yes, true. So you take the starch and mix it with water in a very specific ratio, so that is still liquid. But the interesting thing about this is when you put pressure on this liquid, it becomes like less liquid. So you can play with it first when you just take it in your hand. But when you put this liquid into a loudspeaker with a low frequency, it looks like small animals or something that is alive, something that is dancing. And people are really like drawn into this dance of the water and starch mixture. And then you can talk about viscosity and non-Newtonian fluids, as they are called, after you get the pupil trapped into the magic of science.
I always think the phrase non-Newtonian solids is kind of dramatic. Is it like every time anyone mixes corn flour and water, Isaac Newton turns in his grave?
This is about viscosity. It's not about like the whole Newtonian physics. It's about like the relationship between viscosity and pressure, and basically that there is some change of the viscosity with the pressure. It's not as groundbreaking as it might sound.
Yeah, so it's not like first there was Newton, then there was Einstein, then there was corn flour. So this is kind of classic science communication or science education, right? You grab some people, you show them something cool, and then once they're hooked, you explain the science behind it.
Yeah, I feel when we started that we were not knowing that we were doing science communication. It was more just a feeling of like, we're doing it because it's making a lot of fun. I don't know. And really because we were passionate about it, we had like this aesthetic, also an aesthetic idea behind it that we wanted to fulfill and also develop. But I think when we started to realize that we were doing science communication, it was later on when we were specializing, and also we created a course based on this idea of the experimental stage project, which was called Projects I Come Together, like the two of us here together with Robert Richter and Tobias Schubert. And we were really trying to bring different students, university students from different backgrounds together, putting them into teams in order for them to create like small installations that combine science with some of their interests, things that they liked or they find visually appealing or from a sound perspective. And I think then we realized like the power of science communication and how to really focus our message towards like a bigger spectrum, and like also to trying to implement this into the university and also teach the new generation why it's important to do it. Because at least in our training, like as a physicist, you don't learn about the role of aesthetics or the current social political situations. You don't speak about these as part of the training, like, of course, with friends and family maybe, but I think it's important to understand also the context in which physics is created.
I mean, I think in general, this project that we're doing, one of the motivations behind is not just to communicate something and to change the image of science, for example, or make science more accessible, but also to go into science from a different perspective and to value the aesthetics of science. Art and science can be thought to be a very similar or even the same thing, or that they are even in the hard sciences some aspects of aesthetics and like search for beauty, which are very similar to perhaps the motivations and directions that are usually more associated with art. It was a search also from our side to explore the beauty of science and to show that science can be beautiful.
Okay, so this is interesting because with the kind of science communication activities you've been talking about, I guess the obvious way to try and conceptualize them is that you use the art as what a marketer would call the hook to get people interested in the science, or perhaps as a way to like visualize and begin to understand some scientific concept. But then the science itself is usually thought of as, well, or as not art, something very different from art. And so if the science communication does its job well and you do get that interest in the understanding from your audience, then you can eventually leave the aesthetic stuff behind somehow. But then what you were just saying, Andrea, suggests that you're thinking of it differently, that there is some intrinsic value to the aesthetic side, like it's part of the science itself, or as one with the science. It's not just a hook or an analogy.
Yeah. Also to show the phenomena directly. I mean, is showing non-Newtonian fluids art just because there is some aesthetics in it? Or can I just view it as a physics experiment? So for me, it's kind of hard to draw the line. So is this installation an art installation because it's beautiful and because it attracts some attention? Or is it still a kind of pure science experiment? Yeah, I think at some point not make the distinction too fast or to judge too quickly if something falls either in the category of art or science. Can also be a good thing to leave this more open and perhaps consider some installations or setups as something that is at the same time science and art.
I might just add to these that, of course, like there is maybe a search for beauty, but also there is also a way of visualization of these problems or of these phenomena, I would say, that give you like a very interesting approach towards science, I would say, because in the way you are experiencing the science, you can see it, you can feel it, you can hear it, you can smell it. And this leads also to that you have like a more, a better understanding of what is actually happening there because you are not reading it. You don't have this linear way of understanding. If I would just tell it to you, you would maybe imagine something that could be it, could be not. Especially if you were never in touch with this phenomena or this experiment, you might understand what it means to you, but you might not. And having this kind of visualization or even like being able to touch it, for me, it gives you a more complete understanding of what is actually happening there, which I think it's very interesting to also give access to people who are not part of this community of science.
So we've got quite philosophical quite quickly, which is fun. So then I want to ask, when you say that engaging with a phenomenon aesthetically gives you a more complete understanding of the science, do you mean only what you were just saying at the end there, that it's like a way for non-scientists to be able to get in touch with what scientists can already conceptualize through different means? You know, like an expert can do it by looking at some equations or a graph or by thinking through the way a scientific theory works or whatever. Whereas us poor non-scientists need to see, for instance, this non-Newtonian fluid vibrating on a loudspeaker or something before we can kind of get it in our heads in the same way. So is it just that? Or are you saying, I think you might be saying more than that, that even for a scientist, the aesthetic way of looking at the phenomenon is valuable to you? Like it adds something or helps you, even if you already perfectly understand all the other ways to look at it. I feel like you're saying the second one.
Yes, I think so. Do you want to add something, Andy, or?
No, I'm happy. I'm happy with what you said. But...
because no. Then I want to ask you, what is it? What can there be to a phenomenon that just can't be appreciated in, let's say, quote unquote, scientific or formal ways, even by experts, but that can be appreciated aesthetically through art? Like, I need an example here to get my head around it.
I have like a beautiful example. I was in the Ars Electronica, I think we were together there in 2022, I think. And there was an artist, Marta Handenauer, and she was working also with in London with the politics in order to create awareness around fatbergs.
Fatbergs.
I don't know if you know what these are, but if you start to spill a lot of oil through the thing, then you will get a lot of these fatbergs. And this is a really, really big problem because then
these are these like huge blobs of just solid fat in the sewers, right? That block. Yeah.
That you really have to. They block the water access and also fecal waters and so on. So you have to take them out in order that everything is working fine. And I was reading that, for instance, 35 tons of fatbergs were took out from the London undergrounds. And I'm asking you, how much is 35 tons of fat? Can you really feel it? Can you realize it? Do you have an understanding for this huge number? Because I don't. And then what she was doing, she was putting this kind of fatbergs in the middle of the city so people could actually touch them, like if you wanted, of course, but to touch them, to see them, to understand the size, and to really have an emotional approach towards it and understand this is a problem, because when I throw my oil, this might get out. And this changed the way that you see it, because you suddenly understand what is happening there. And I mean, 35 tons of fatbergs is like the size of 3 double-decker buses. So it's quite a lot.
Yeah. It reminds me of those YouTube videos where they're trying to help you get your head
Powers
around.
of 10.
Yeah, exactly. You start with the size of a bacterium or something, or I don't know, a quark, and then you zoom out, and then you're looking at a whole person and then the whole planet, and it keeps on going, out to the galaxy. And I guess the distance between the very small magnitudes and the very large ones is wide enough that we can't intuitively comprehend it. So you certainly can't get it just by writing 1,000 zeros after a number. So I think this is cool. We've gone from using art for analogies and attention grabbing to this idea that we actually need art as an intrinsic part of understanding science. Which means I now want to then push the conversation one step further by asking, are there examples of art being used in the process of doing science, like as part of the scientific method, rather than just a way to understand the results?
So again, I think it's hard to really draw the line between the arts and the sciences. One example that I really like, because it is like also art emerging from science, is a group called the Barabasi Lab. This is a group who was doing like network science for the last 25 years. But what they also did is not just trying to describe the networks as a purely like abstract thing. For sure, they did the theoretical description. But what they also did in a parallel manner was to develop a visual language for networks. And I would consider this art. And it took some decades that it was considered art now, like kind of officially, and that it made its way into the big museums like MoMA or like the Center for Media and Arts in Germany. Now this group has higher visibility, I would say, even in the arts than in the sciences. And especially with like complex networks, it's really hard to understand what is going on. So one of the first examples, what they looked at is the relationship between different diseases. And like to just have a big table, for example, like how different diseases relate to each other hinders the understanding of the whole topic. And to have a good visualization, or perhaps even like a data sculpture or physicalization of a network, accelerates the scientific process.
Yes, I have to say I wanted to add like also an example which I really love. I really love their work. Maybe you know them. They are called Forensic Architecture, and they are a research agency based in London too. And they work together like artists, scientists, and experts of various fields together with stakeholders of outside of the university and academia, like Amnesty International. They work all together to bring open source investigations on state and corporate violence. They use artistic methods and also scientific ones. Sometimes they are equal, like both artists and scientists use the same kind of methods, but they use methods from all of the disciplines to really get to an understanding of these really difficult problems. And one problem that I can maybe show, it's that they were asking themselves how to measure digital violence. And they were observing like what Pegasus, this malware created by the NSO group, who could access to your phones without even like you noticing it. So they really did a worldwide investigation on how this Pegasus was entering the phones. And they not only documented, measured, and mapped this whole digital violence that was happening worldwide, they plotted it in an interactive and that is even today continuously updated platform. And for this visualization and for this work, they were working with artists. And for instance, musician Brian Eno was sonifying this map that they created in order to understand the patterns of it. And they realized because of these maps that every time that this kind of digital violence was happening towards someone, the whole families and people of their surroundings were also targeted, and they got also Pegasus, but also that it always followed physical act of violence after they were like infected by Pegasus. So really they tried to really create this investigation and not just map, but also create also a language around digital violence, because it was not known before when they did it. They were really going on every aspect, creating language, mapping it. And also they were doing film ethnography, which means that they were interviewing the people that were attacked by Pegasus. Like they were explaining how it was for them and what experiences they had. So really they created a multimedial investigation. And one of the speakers, Shuri Molavi, was telling that they did this investigation. And although it was really interesting and really brutal what they find out, nothing happened afterwards. After they printed these like pages and pages of investigation and results. So afterwards, they decided that they had to mobilize, and then they went to the media, they went to galleries, the press, to policymakers and different people, and created, together also with artists there, different installations or whatever, adapting to the different target groups that they wanted to speak about. And I think this is a really interesting way of really co-creating information and really opening a field even that was never spoken before. And I was also reading that in 2024, forensic architecture was assessed by the European Research Council as a scientific breakthrough. And they were working with artists and also people from other disciplines.
Okay. And now I'm feeling kind of stupid because listening to this, it's clear that data visualization and data sonification, or whatever the noun is, these things don't just like present information in a different way. They can also expose patterns that you wouldn't see otherwise. And now I'm thinking, of course they do. That's why we use figures and diagrams. That's why the graph was invented, right? In the simplest possible case, you have two variables, you plot them against each other. You might only notice a correlation when you notice that the dots make a line. And you could look at a table of numbers all day and not see that. So I feel stupid, like I said, that this didn't occur to me already.
Yeah, it's difficult to understand and see. You need to experience also this connection in order to understand why it's important, why it's productive. And it's sometimes also very challenging also to work with artists and other people from other disciplines. Like we both know it from like years and years of working with different people, but because we have a different understanding of how the world functions. And at the end, it's really you are learning so many different things and to take really other perspective on the problems that you were always looking at the same way.
Yeah, I think also in this time of like big data and like more and more complex topics that research is done on, we need more ways to like look at the thing that we are trying to research. For sure, speaking from a physics perspective, we are kind of trained to do visualizations, but these are more like basic. So typical graphs, for example, that have two axes, and perhaps you show not only a line, but then a confidence interval, for example. But there's so much development in also computer graphics and like 3D representation, like media art scene. There's also technological advancement that is not really finding its way into the sciences and into this kind of knowledge production. And I think we need to collaborate to make all these advancements productive. Yeah, for example, when we speak about AI and big data and a data set, I think only few people have even an idea of what a data set looks like, or like how to visualize it in a way that we can get some kind of feeling for what we are actually dealing with.
Do policymakers, like, how do you deal when you have this big data? How do you understand, like, if you have these complex topics in policy, how do you deal with these? Because I mean, not all of us physicists know what is behind an AI. This is really something kind of very specialized understanding, and you only understand if a data set it's really good and non-biased because you understand what are the problems. Like when you actually do a data set, like, or you train an AI with a data set, and you understand where are your limits. So I'm asking like myself or the two of you, like, how do you deal with these in policy making? Because even I try to maybe explain what AI is and what the problems or the risks are. How do you make really people understand what Andrea was telling us?
This is where you want me to contribute, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree the problem can be very serious. We were talking a little while ago about the problem of people not getting their heads around really big numbers, or rather not being able to understand or visualize why one apparently huge number can still be significantly bigger or smaller than another huge number. We know like bad policy gets made when you have a policymaker who thinks about 5 billion and 5 trillion and 5 million as basically the same kind of thing. And so, yeah, you're also right. When you have super complex policy problems with huge amounts of data, this is a challenge for policy for sure. I think a common solution, like the go-to solution that I've heard quite a few times on this podcast, is to try and boil it down, to try and either eliminate complexity or hide it or process it all behind the scenes and just give like a simple message to policymakers. But you're pointing to a different kind of solution, if I understand you rightly, where instead you're trying to convert the complexity from data to art, to something visual or auditory or physical. And then if you do it well, that can go some way to making the huge complexity manageable and visible without having to flatten it.
You just brought it all together. I think this is really, really what we are trying to really to get to let people experience this problematic and this complexity. And maybe I think there are different approaches for doing so, but I think it's really important, especially if like for these wicked problems that we have nowadays, these global challenges that we have and that are very important that we try to solve together.
Yeah, we were looking at some of the evidence reports, for example, and we also noticed that you have to reduce complexity. And I mean, it makes sense. And I totally get it why these reports have this kind of form, and that they are somehow like simple statements, also statements that all different disciplines can agree on. This must also be a big challenge when you work together with people from different disciplines and you have to write a report together, and in the end everybody has to be kind of fine with it. And I imagine this process to be also messy, or perhaps sometimes also there's conflicts that have to be resolved. But I think all this complexity cannot be easily represented in a report. And I think here the art could really play an interesting role, because it is not so much bound to be objective or perhaps really one-to-one representative of the scientific community, but it can be more subjective. It can show only like specific aspects. There's not so much the need for representing all the knowledge, but perhaps like picking out one example and making this example really relatable, and keeping more colors and more feelings, and not boiling it all
You don't
down.
have to take away these reports. They are important and they are really necessary. But still, you can maybe as an add-on have this other approach where you really make the whole scientists, the whole advice committee and the policymakers really like experience the problem, like in a direct manner. Just for instance, if you are discussing about energy transition, to really go to the place and really observe the wind turbines, or really if you are talking about biodiversity, really go there and experience what it means when it's not there anymore, or how it was and it's like maybe being destroyed. And or maybe like have more kind of an indirect approach, and that's mediated through art, just like as film ethnography or really installations that shows an important part of it, or really creating a small AI in case that helps understanding and showing the people how it works, and let them make a data set that is working and understanding where are the boundaries. I think there are many artistic methods, or where an artist could bring another perspective on how to showcase maybe points of tension and really make them productive. Because why to hide them? Why not to show them and understand that this is something that might be difficult to implement because of this complexity? Because I mean, like, then you have to really bring these quite simple suggestions into really complex implementations, and having a better understanding of what the problem is about. I think it's really important for the complexity of this problem.
Yeah, the point about implementation is very well taken. I mean, you can flatten the complexity all you like as an input to policymaking, but the output of policymaking is still going to have to feed back into the real world, which is still going to be complex. So like finding ways to preserve that complexity during the process might be the only option, really. So having said all that, I also want to kind of challenge this a bit, because it seems to me that there is one important difference, or at least one important difference, between the job of communicating science to a general audience, so like public engagement work, and also to an extent within the scientific community. These are fairly free and open activities where you can be creative and cool and make exciting visualizations and add sound and make bicycles that are also musical instruments and all that kind of thing. But when it comes to science advice to policy, there are often a bunch of extra constraints which are introduced quite deliberately to control and limit what can be said and done, to make science advice institutionally acceptable, democratically acceptable. So some examples here are that it needs to be, as far as possible, objective, or at least consensual. It needs to be reproducible. It needs to be fact-based. It needs to be transparent so that anyone, any voter or lobby group can look at what's been done. And that's kind of the big one I want to lean on a bit here, because you need it for accountability. We elect our democratic leaders, and so we need to be able to see what evidence they used and judge whether they responded to it appropriately. And that means that in principle, we need to have access to the same kinds of information that they did, so we can assess their performance. And this is like a requirement for democracy. It's not like we expect every voter to read an academic journal, obviously, but we should be able to follow that trail of evidence back, at least in principle. And I think that could be one reason why scientific advice, science for policy, is often done in these quite conservative ways, where you have to present everything in a book with pages, with words on the pages and some simple diagrams and, an executive summary at the front which everyone can read. It's not about laziness necessarily, or lack of imagination, or even accessibility. It's also about accountability. And I kind of feel sorry for the first Prime Minister who stands up in Parliament and has to defend the decision that they made in a particular area by saying, well, I had this really transformative personal experience when I was exposed to this art installation, and now I can see that I need to do X rather than Y. And if only you'd been there, you'd see it too. I mean, I'm being a bit overdramatic probably, and you can tell me if I'm setting up a straw man, but I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, I completely understand this concern, and I think it's really important that if you try to, or if you do bring artists into the team, you have to really be in conversation all the time with the scientists, and it should be also the output shouldn't be not signed by the people who are giving advice. They should also see and be okay with it. And the other thing about accountability, I think you can maybe realize which formats can you also document and give back to the society so they can also access them. And I feel if you don't use this kind of formats, maybe this is a really, I don't know if it's true or not, maybe we can discuss it, but I feel if you don't give this emotional or this possibility of really experiencing these problems, then you leave it to the experience that these people had before, to the books that they read when they were at school, to the media that they are consuming. And why not to generate a media or a piece of work that everyone can access to and give you the same kind of information? I think this would be kind of more transparent than actually just relying on the knowledge that they had before in terms of emotional response towards this topic.
Yeah, I think something that we did not talk about is that there's another step between the results or the reports. So you have this boiled down scientific evidence that you hand over to a politician, but that is also publicly available. And as we're talking about it now, it seems like it's all 100% clear, and that there's not another layer of judging this information or selecting, reading it in a way that you perhaps want to read it. So for sure, it is as objective as possible, but still there's a layer of interpretation and sense making. And it is the question if this process of sense making can be supported by different media, and to give to even kind of help people to understand what does this really mean. So, okay, there is an increased level of CO2 in the air, and we have an increased temperature on the globe. But what does that mean? What would it feel like? What would it look like? And how to really understand it on a deeper level.
And I wanted to add that searching a little bit for the podcast, I saw that there is a policy lab in the UK that actually has included some artists in the policymaking process. So they are actually using design and art in order to enter certain discussions and find solutions. So they are managing, I think, also in the process of when you have an interdisciplinary group, we were talking before, that you have to find first a group of experts that have different perspectives, and also you have to bring them together. So I mean, there you can also use design methods or art-based methods to bring them together and really, really get to a point. And why not to show them too and really work with these methods and make something out of it. I feel that there is a lot of potential for really doing this in a way that is accountable. And I think there are countries where this is already happening. Why cannot we do it here in Europe?
Yeah, and that gives me another opportunity to repeat something that long-time listeners will be bored of hearing me repeat, which is that when you have disciplinary diversity, you don't just get different perspectives, which of course you do, and you need when you're trying to answer big complex questions with lots of different dimensions, and at the cost of some stress and difficulty in reconciling the perspectives and getting a coherent answer. You don't just get that, you also get different ways of thinking that perhaps look at a problem and find different solutions or different approaches to it in a way that you would not get if you had a room full of just physicists, or indeed, I don't know, just Western Europeans or just men. And maybe the same is true, perhaps this is part of what you were saying, Clara, The same might be true if you put artists in a room. You don't just get extra information from, as it were, the art world. You also get a whole new way of approaching problems and thinking about how to solve them.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And I experienced it myself, like in the initiative that we had, like with artists and scientists. It was really creating friction a lot of the times because they were like, how don't you see the problem? And we was like, why don't you see the problem? But we were talking about different problems. And we had to create this space to get to a consensus where we both learn from each other and really create new perspectives on how to be together. So yes, I think it creates a really good friction that is difficult to deal. And that's why I think there are a lot of methods and it's being investigated. And there is a lot of research going on in the art science interface, as well as design methods or artistic research on how to deal with these differences and these different perspectives, which are very important to me, but I think to our democracy too.
Well, on that striking note, I think it's time we drew this rich and thoughtful and provocative conversation to a close. I'm really personally very grateful to both of you, Andy and Clara, for being willing to continue on tape, as it were, a conversation that we started in person the best part of a year ago. It's been enormously rewarding to me to have these exchanges, and I'm happy that our audience as Science for Policy geeks now gets to hear at least this part of it.
Yeah, we touched quite some topics in a little bit of a chaotic manner, I think.
Thank you, Toby.
The Science for Policy podcast is created by the Scientific Advice Mechanism to the European Commission. It's produced and presented by Toby Wardman, with additional editing by Nina Skorchak. The Scientific Advice Mechanism provides evidence-based expertise and policy recommendations to inform policymaking in the European Commission. This podcast is funded by the EU via the SAPEA Consortium. Our theme music is composed by Carlo Alfredo Piatti and performed by Elisaveta Shushenko.